Glad you could join us today on another episode of Hands-On Business Podcast. I'm your host, Hakeem Adebiyi, as hopefully you know by now, and I try to bring you interesting guests that can give you business ideas and tips on starting, developing, or growing your business. Now, on today's program, we're joined by Everett Crossland and Andy Molnar, who are both experts in commercialization of digital therapeutics, and we're going to get into that. So Everett leads the commercial organization at Cognito Therapeutics, and he's the chief commercial officer. And so he's leading Cognito's commercial readiness, marketing, sales, and health economic evidence development for the company's breakthrough treatment portfolio. Now, interestingly enough, then I met Everett on LinkedIn, which was very, and I say interestingly enough, because a couple of episodes ago, I was doing about B2B lead generation, and LinkedIn, we were talking about how to connect with people. And I can't quite remember how we met. I don't know if you listened to one of my podcasts or entered a poll, but we met on LinkedIn and we were in a similar kind of space. Everett's in healthcare and digital therapeutics. I'm in healthcare as well. And then we connected and were interested to get this podcast together. And then he introduced me to Andy. So it shows that LinkedIn does work, and that when you're not specifically looking for something, you can find it in the most unusual of places. So that leads us on to Andy, and Andy Molnar is the CEO of the Digital Therapeutics Alliance. And that's a trade organization. And Andy spent the last 3.5 years focusing on how to commercialize software as a medical device products. So today is really one, I'm going to say, for the healthcare space, because we're all in that sort of space. But I'm sure what we're going to talk about is all transferable to other business sectors as well, because we're going to specifically be talking about how do you create, launch, and monetize a new category. So Everett first, and then Andy, tell the listeners what you would consider to be your superpower, i.e. the one or two things that you think you add to any organization over and above what other people would be able to do.
Yeah, sure. So, I know we got some of these questions in advance, and I appreciate that. And that it really is such a tough kind of introspective question to answer. I thought about answering in two ways. One is, I think more than anything, I tend to come into companies that are going through a stage change and helping them really focus in on what is a core area of focus that should be their end goal that's multiple years out, and then helping them kind of stay on track and focus through those stage changes and all that change management that is required through that process. And that's not necessarily a superpower that came naturally to me. It was kind of forced on me as I jumped into small startup companies where focus is always of utmost importance and also often challenged. The other way I thought about answering that question is like the superpower that I would love to be able to have. And be able to bring to an organization. So kind of an aspirational superpower that I probably don't have today. And I think that would probably, in these organizations that are small and growing and going through stage change, I would love to be able to be a better connector across these different functions, because again, similar to the challenge of focus, I also see a challenge in these companies where even at a very small stage, silos start to form. And I know Andy can speak to this, and we all think about silos in large companies, but really at some point in time, those silos formed when everything was quite small. And in balancing that aspirational superpower against the superpower of focus, I think, is something that I'll continue to strive for throughout my career. But yeah, I think that's really how I think about bringing a superpower to small digital health growth stage companies.
Well, your superpower which you have is one which is obviously critical in business, because lots of people can't see the end and can't manage the whole process and can't bring it all together. And then the superpower you aspire to have is one that I just did a podcast on, in terms of how do you ensure that everybody's involved and that you don't have silos forming, which I'm sure Andy can speak more to. So yeah, sorry, Andy, over to you.
Well, it's interesting that Everett said that, because I was going to say that my superpower is the power of collaboration. And I think though, the way that, Everett was talking about it within an organization, I kind of think of it as how we approach getting work done, especially in startup environments like this. And which is why I found myself heading up a trade organization, is because I didn't just look to the success of the organizations that I was working for prior to this at Therapeutics and then Cognito. I was more thinking, well, if the whole industry, or if one of these companies is going to be successful, then the whole industry needs to be successful, right? And so it's that internal collaboration and external collaboration. And if you can do that in a way where it's not cutthroat, you're not at each other all the time, and you're just thinking, how are we driving an industry forward as a group, even if we have different needs and our pathways don't match entirely, you start to see that it's the driving force, right? And I think you can take those external sort of collaboration ideas and keep them internal and create a culture where people get work done, whether you're mean to them or nice to them, right? It's their job. They're going to get there, right? But I've always found that it's so much better, and people will come up and wake up in the morning wanting to get work done, and we'll go above and beyond if you can create that proper culture that is all about everybody being successful.
And just as a matter of interest in this current environment, Andy, has that been made more difficult with the obviously coronavirus? We can't meet as often as we could, etc. How have you managed that? Because that'd be really useful to know.
Yeah, well, for sure. It's definitely been harder. I mean, some of the main places we would go is conferences, other trade organizations, Unmet, NCPDP, et cetera. And any business that you're in was going to have a trade organization that's part of it. And you would start talking to people with similar interests. And I mean, I know I personally struggled during COVID to keep those connections alive, because even the virtual conferences were hard to network the way that I'm used to networking. I think probably the fortunate thing for me, and I'm sure for Everett too, is that we went into the coronavirus having been in this industry for long enough that we knew a lot of the players. So where I missed out on was probably the new entrance into digital therapeutics, but at least we had those connections already established prior.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I like the kind of positive take on this part of such a tragic event and kind of episode in our history is that I think a lot of us in our companies realized very quickly that we were entering novel territory, right? In novel territory in the sense of, how do you run a business during this time? How do you stay afloat? How do you raise money? How do you engage and continue to scale with customers in a new way? And so I think a lot of us really started to reach out more aggressively to share notes and learnings. It's something that we, as Andy said, we just kind of tend to do at the various conferences and nexus points where we just naturally bump into each other. But in this case, we were all facing this challenge, and none of us had faced before, and it forced us to really lean on each other and trade notes in and still maintain a competitive nature, but trade notes in a way that helped us be better in our organizations. I during that time I joined a group of biotech executives here in the Massachusetts area that really, and it still exists today on WhatsApp, and and the entire point of that group, I think that's now about 200 executives, is to help share notes on, what to do for things like as simple or complicated as return to work. So, we're not talking about really meaty subjects like, how to run a randomized controlled study during COVID. We're talking about the things that are nuts and bolts in an industry. And yet when we share those, again, in a way that maintains a competitive nature across the industry, I think it helps us be better in our organizations, and we can take any number of notes back that help us really scale during an extraordinary time. And obviously, with COVID, there's going to be a lasting impact here. I think certain changes are here, I would assume, to stay. And one of those changes, since we're talking about scaling a novel category, is how to engage. And I think, as Hakeem, as you opened this podcast, how to scale in a way that maybe doesn't necessarily take as much in-person engagement. And to your point about, some of the content that you put out there coming back in a way that maybe was unexpected, or maybe reaches across industries that you'd not expected. I think that's one of the learnings that we see in COVID, is that, we can engage with customers and we can engage with stakeholders, to kind of put myself into Andy's shoes momentarily, across an industry in a way that is virtual, maintain and build relationships virtually. And that really has taken multiple pressures to achieve, because prior to COVID, many of us probably would have been fine with saying, let's initiate this online, and then let's fly out and have the dinner and do all of that. But maybe in the back of all our minds before, where we were having that first meeting after flying to, some place that typically you wouldn't want to fly to, or you wouldn't necessarily naturally fly to. Maybe in the back of our minds, we were all thinking, couldn't have we just done this online? And now it feels more natural to do it. And it's so much more efficient and cost efficient, time efficient. And I think that some of those things are here to stay. There's still incredible value in meeting in person. And you see that in, some of these return to work policies, where I think we recognize there's a balance to be achieved there too.
Yeah, no, I think I was speaking to one of my colleagues at a pharmaceutical company, and his concern was they've had the best year for quite some time and had minimal costs. And obviously the board are now thinking, well, we can do this every year, can't we? So, traveling and meeting people is key when you try to build categories, etc. But obviously people are now looking at the bottom line and thinking, can't you do that again year in, year out without spending the money that you used to spend before COVID? So I think that's probably going to be one of the challenges as we move forward. So thanks for that. So in terms of, your areas of expertise, it's all around therapeutics. And I'll be honest, I don't know a huge amount about digital therapeutics. I know a lot about therapeutics, and digital are starting to become an emerging category. So can you explain exactly what digital therapeutics are and what purpose they serve as opposed to standard therapeutics?
Sure. Do you want me to jump on this one, Everett, first?
Yeah, go for it, Andy. Yeah.
Since I'm heading up the industry, kind of. So I'll keep it simple. Software as a medical device is how we are regulated within the FDA, but we're a subsection of that. So digital therapeutic is any software-based product that's clinically evaluated and evidence-based to treat, manage, or prevent a medical condition. As an example, you can treat nightmare disorder. There's therapeutics in the works for autism, right? There's a lot in diabetes, musculoskeletal, and Alzheimer's, as I'm sure Everett will get into later. And these are all incredibly novel products. And the therapies that they provide, since they've been tested against similar endpoints to drugs, have incredible impact on patients' lives. Now, the reason it's important is, there are over 300,000 mobile health apps on the App Store. And we're sort of in this space where it's reminiscent of when people would go around and sell elixirs from town to town. And, it was probably like, sugar syrup and things that maybe made your stomach feel better or whatever, but people didn't really know what they were taking. They were just looking for some sort of elixir that would help them with any number of issues that they've had at the time. And from there, people were like, okay, now I want to know what it is I'm actually putting in my body. How does this drug treat my issues? Is it pain? Is it, diabetes, et cetera? And so we're in this space where we're saying, okay, sure, there are a lot of mobile health apps that are awesome, right? And they help a lot of people. But without a clinical study, you don't really know what you're putting in your body. You don't know what you're doing to yourself. And we've gotten to a point where these products actually can cause harm, right? So if you have a product that helps you treat your diabetes and it does not tell you the proper way to handle your diabetes, you could die, right? And that's not the only one. There are products out there for cancer as well, helping patients. And so we really need to transition. It's a natural progression into a way that we validate those products that could potentially not be safe or, are impacting people for the rest of their lives in many cases. And so the digital therapeutics industry has come about because of that. And then also because of this understanding that if this is true healthcare, how is it going to fit into the healthcare ecosystem? Because as we know, it moves slow and it's not easy to change. And these types of products aren't quite as much of a natural fit as you would like, right? And so one more point, and then I'll hand it over to Everett. But when I started in this industry, the first thing I said was, well, how do you e-prescribe these products? How would a doctor go into their EMR and click to order it or click to say, I want to prescribe this to a patient? And then how does that get in the patient's hands? So the first thing I did with somebody from Achilles, Jeffrey Abraham, who's another leader in our space, we went to NCPDP and formed the Digital Therapeutics Task Group to figure out how these types of products would actually sit along other pharmaceutical and medical device products. And that was sort of the beginning of, not the beginning, there was other things going on, but building the piping for how everything is going to start to function within this complex healthcare space.
Obviously, I mean, I work for traditional, not anymore, but I used to work for traditional pharma companies. So the big boys, the Pfizers, the Novartis, etc. How are they trying to get into the space? Are they seeing this as a threat to their long-term strategies? What's the dynamics there?
Got it, Everett.
Yeah. And I know you can comment on this as well. And the entire space is evolved and continues to evolve. With the pharma companies being part of that evolution, right? So I think if you asked somebody from Pfizer, even just 5 or 6 years ago, their perspective on digital health and digital therapeutics, you may have ended up talking to somebody either on the clinical team who was looking at some digital biomarkers, especially at Pfizer at that time, or you'd be talking to somebody on their marketing team who's thinking of digital marketing, and maybe they're like bridging into, apps that are a little bit more than marketing, but like kind of wrapping around the patient experience. And today, that has largely evolved, that perspective. Now, there's still an entire industry looking at digital biomarkers and making extraordinary progress there. But in addition to that, you have large teams across, I would say, nearly every pharma company in the top 20 when you think about market cap, but even beyond the top 20 when you think about market cap, that have a team focused on digital therapeutics, whether it's a standalone digital therapeutics franchise that they're contemplating or advancing, or it's a companion to their drug portfolio or their biologic portfolio, and then some diagnostics as well that are being contemplated by these companies. And, I think Andy made a really good point. When we think about a novel category, and Cognito we really look at Cognito as a novel class of digital therapeutics within a novel category, because we're one of the few companies that's coming out with or advancing a disease modifying treatment and portfolio of treatments that really goes beyond some of the prior generations. And that in and of itself presents some challenges, but also some opportunities. But when you think about like what Andy's talking about, kind of the railing or the rails or the plumbing and infrastructure, we're really still there as an industry. We're still at that point as an industry where just to use multiple different imageries in one comment or paragraph here, but we're really at that stage where the framing of the house is still being built, and it requires some of the pioneers in the space, Cognoa being one, Pear and Achille, and now that those next generations in the form of Cognito coming in and pushing the stakeholders to build out the rest of the house, because without that push and without bringing something that's extraordinarily valuable to the table, you're not going to see the rest of the house get built, because there's just not enough motivation. And pharma companies are really key in doing that, because pharma companies are accustomed to bringing the level of evidence that is necessary to get physicians and payers on board, and they're financed to be able to do that too. And our industry is, this year and last year, is really starting to see the financing available for us to bring the evidence to bear, such that physicians and payers see a body of evidence that is compelling to them. And in prior years, that hasn't always been the case. And I think with these stakeholders really coming into play, and the new financing that COVID has helped drive as well, I think in the coming years we're going to see the adoption curve and the scale curve really move into maybe an early majority stage, whereas right now we're still in the early adopter stage.
So, I mean, you've both worked in companies at different stages. You're just talking about adoption there, so this is probably ideal. So different stages of the lifestyle journey, life cycle journey, should I say. And we obviously want to get into discussing, how do you get from creation of a category, because these are effectively, as you said, novel and new categories. So how do you go from that creation of that category and then monetizing it? Can you talk us through those steps? How do you even decide what area you're going to go to at the outset?
Yeah, and Andy, jump in here too. I'll be quick with this answer. I think a lot of it is driven by your opportunity. So if you look at the earlier generations of digital therapeutics, there was the technological capacity matched to kind of low-hanging fruit in opportunity. So Pear Therapeutics, for example, look largely for a number of years, and now they're branching out beyond this, but largely for a number of years was very focused on digitized cognitive behavioral therapy applied against high cost, high need spaces like addiction, depression, schizophrenia, et cetera. And so you look at what your technology can do today and how it can evolve very quickly with certain investments, and where your highest need is. And that, those match up to a place where you're more likely to have success, while at the same time, there are plenty of failed companies that did just that. And some of it, it still comes down to a little bit of luck and who can raise enough money to survive the trough. But you look at those earlier companies like Pear, Achille, Cognoa, Valentis, Omada, Livongo, they were leveraging available technologies with a vision to advancing those technologies, but leveraging available technologies to solve an acute and unmet need that everybody felt was highly painful at that moment. And that at least gives you a higher likelihood of success, even if your most likely scenario is failure at that early stage.
Thank you. Andy, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I guess thinking of that, it's a lot of, people that work in technology, right? The Silicon Valley type companies very often think, all right, I can put this technology out there and it'll go viral, right? It's going to take off. And I think, when I started, there was this mindset that this is the coolest thing that anyone's done in healthcare for years, and that as soon as it's put out in the market, people are going to adopt it and they're going to use it. And I think, where we've gotten to after drinking the Kool-Aid for so long, is truly your ability to listen to the market, to understand where you sit. So, I mean, if you're better off as an employer-based benefit than you are being prescribed by a doctor in primary care or in a specialty setting, understand what that is. And then like Everett said, the level of evidence that you need to bring to those individuals to get your product paid for, right? The level of evidence that you need to bring to an employer is generally not as high as if you're going to an Anthem or a United, right? I should say not generally not as high. It's never as high. But if you want national coverage, then talking to those national payers and truly understanding what you need 3 to 4 years from now so that they'll adopt you, do that legwork now and understand if that's the right fit without going down a pathway for 2 or 3 years thinking that everyone's going to adopt it just because it's so cool.
If I can add one thing to that, and Andy, I know you're going to smile when I say this, because like in a novel category, that level of evidence, it's really interesting that you have to do more than just like your analog, right? So sure, digital therapeutics are medical devices as regulated by FDA of some kind or another, right? And medical devices often come to market with smaller studies, quicker studies. The durability is often compared to predicates and things like that. Now that's a generalization. There are plenty of medical devices that come to market with pretty extraordinary data, but the majority, because of the way the regulatory framework is set up for medical devices, come with a lower level of evidence or lower bar of evidence to meet. When a digital therapeutic is put in front of a payer or a physician, because it is a novel modality, you have to bring actually extra evidence. You have to go like that extra mile. I mean, and a great example of this is at Cognito Therapeutics. We're conducting and expect to conduct a phase 3 study that's on par with a drug-like study, even though we're digital therapeutic. And the reason for that is, I mean, we've done research we've conducted research with payers and physicians, and the majority of them said, we love your phase 2 data. We actually had 89% of physicians say that they would be eager to use our product, which is the highest number I've seen in my career. And so we're excited about that. At the same time, payers and physicians are also saying, if you achieve what you say you're going to achieve, you have to substantiate that with the level of evidence on par with a drug, even though we recognize that you're something else. And that is part of the challenge of a novel category. You have to bring more evidence than even some of your peers in other categories, simply because it's this new thing that people have to wrap their heads around, and you just have to kind of bowl them over with this mountain of evidence.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to ask actually, because very topical, and it has been for a few years, is our friend Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos. And I've read her book. Well, not her book. I've read the book. I've listened. I've watched the film, And the lack of evidence fascinates me, and the amount of people that she engaged and got involved. Do you think those sort of disasters like that affect the digital therapeutics industry? Does it tarnish it? Do people start thinking, oh, well, is this another one of those, or is it just completely, yeah, this is a one-off?
So I don't think we were necessarily colored by Theranos specifically, but Andy brought up kind of this, the example of snake oil and like kind of the gray area that digital health and digital therapeutics are, there's always this kind of gray area on either end of that spectrum. And there are operators on either end of the spectrum that speak beyond their evidence. And I think organizations like DTA are incredibly important for maintaining integrity. But it's also incumbent upon organizations like Cognito Therapeutics and others that we have to be a loud voice in saying that we are bringing really compelling safety and efficacy data, so that you can't even compare us to the company that is saying the same thing but without evidence. Yeah. And my last company, I was at a virtual reality therapeutics company, and we consistently found companies who were competitors of ours citing our clinical data to substantiate their own product. And so there are, I mean, think if like Glaxo did that with a Pfizer product, right? It would be, I mean, there'd be lawsuits all over everywhere. And yet we're at that stage where there's still some, a little bit of Wild West in this industry. And so we have to do better. And the leaders in the space have to use the money that's raised to bring the right evidence to bear in a level of evidence that is just indisputable. The difference between the good actors and the not so good actors.
Yeah, and I would add, I know Everett, when we started in this industry, everybody thought it wasn't real. Like every stakeholder we talked to said, I don't know if I believe you.
Well, and first they said, wait, what?
And it has come, I mean, in 3.5 years, the difference is incredible. I actually have insurance companies reach out to me at working at different companies as opposed to the opposite, because they've gone from thinking there's no way this would ever reside within our system and doctors saying, that sounds okay, to people saying technology is going to be a huge part of the future of healthcare no matter what. And the endpoints that these guys are starting to show, where back then there was like 2 or 3 products that anybody had ever heard of, and most people hadn't heard of any of them at all. And now there's, I don't know exactly how many, but at least being worked on, probably in the hundreds, and the endpoints that they show are meaningful. And in some places there aren't even drugs that you can use to help in these different disease states. Autism, for example, right? You can use atypical antipsychotics on 10-year-olds. That's like your choice. Nobody wants to prescribe an atypical antipsychotic to a 10-year-old. And so bringing in something that can change that disorder for the rest of that child's life, potentially, people aren't ignoring that anymore, So that's the only thing I'd add.
Yeah, just one extra point there. I think that when thinking about a novel category, it is really important to think of, and this is, in one sense, it's an obvious statement, but when you get into healthcare, it becomes less obvious. But really think about what are those targets that either your product or your category can address, that no other category, not just no other product, but no other category can address, right? And we've seen companies like Cognoa and Achille do this quite well. Cognito is addressing novel targets as well. I think that, and actually MedRhythms is doing this as well. There are examples of companies that really are leveraging the novelty and the modality to address currently and at least for the foreseeable future undruggable targets and pathways. And I think when you're able to do that, immediately you get an audience, and then it's kind of your game to lose as far as the evidence that you bring to that audience.
Okay, thank you. So what's coming through quite clear is, number one, you need to identify the unmet need. Number two, you then have to present with the evidence and make sure that you're speaking to the right people with the right evidence. So, I mean, you mentioned, Everett, just before, there's a couple of companies that have fallen by the wayside. So, I suppose it's two sides of the same coin. Why did they fall by the wayside? And then what are the key things that you have to do to, once you found the unmet need, to actually then monetize that product and bring it through so it's successfully commercially?
Yeah, I think that there are really good companies out there that we saw not make it. And I think some of it, like Lantern is an early example of that. Good company, really, really skilled professionals in that company. It was digitized cognitive behavioral therapy as well. And some of this is just statistics, right? That you literally are, if you have hundreds of companies trying to accomplish something that is really, really high risk in that you're trying to scale a novel category, you just, no matter how good every company is, you're going to get some percent, even in that top echelon, who fail, and that can come down to management of use of proceeds, from a raise, whether a clinical study didn't read out in time, or read out and needed additional data, et cetera. It's just, this is a high risk endeavor. And so statistically, you're going to see failures. I think looking at it from a postmortem perspective and how some of those companies could have done better, and this is very easy to say today, and having lived it, very difficult to say in the moment. And we're kind of coming full circle here to some extent, but often there is a challenge with focus between the story that needs to be told, or often is told to investors, and the work that needs to be done in the company to advance your company and your endpoints to a place where you're de-risking the asset or de-risking the endeavor. And the confusion between those two can cause a lot of issues, and can distract a company for years. If all you're focusing on is the story to the investors, you may not end up actually moving your company forward. And sometimes you end up moving your company forward by default. But that is something that is an ongoing challenge with an industry that is largely venture backed. And we have venture capitalist investors to thank for the successes that we have today. But yeah, I would say you could point to some of the confusion between those two as results for some failures as well.
Mm-hmm. We've heard a lot of people say we don't want to be like we don't want to be Friendster, right? And in the different companies, and I'm like, yeah, but some of us are gonna be. It's unfortunate, but that's just the way it works.
Yep.
Well, I kind of see that almost fits into what you were saying right at the outset about your superpower, Everett, in terms of keeping the eye on what actually the long-term aim is, and what you're trying to deliver through those processes, and then managing that process, because it is very easy when you're in a venture capital backed business to be 100% focused on what they're saying that they need and what you've sold to them to get the finance in the first place, and you're trying to, if that 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 dichotomy of, well, we still need to do some of this because we need to meet with them regularly and they have to be happy with it, but is that exactly what we need to do to actually make this business successful? So I get that. That's a really interesting challenge that all, I think, venture capital backed businesses have to dance. Obviously, it's not one size fits all. Obviously, Andy, you work with a lot of different businesses. Is there some of those like key planks for success to get from, we've found an unmet need and we want to now commercialize that product? What are those key steps that you'd suggest if there's a new person listening today that knows nothing about digital therapeutics but has an idea and has some backing?
Yeah, I mean, it's start with your clinical validation, right? And while you're working on that, make sure that you know how you want to commercialize, right? So I can't say everyone's going to do it the same way because they obviously won't. There are a lot of decisions that you can make that that are really just your preference, right? If you outsource field sales, if you partner with a pharma company, if you build out your full sales structure yourself, it's not like one of those ways is going to ensure success or ensure failure. In fact, that my opinion, they can all work, right? And they can all fail. Yeah. So the second piece is really that the evidence, and I know we've been talking about evidence a lot, but your health econ data, your retrospective studies on claims data, your ability to explain to the market how it will fit in once you found that unique way that it might function properly. And also really understanding and being honest with yourself about what it's worth, right? I've heard everything from this product could be $10 to this product could almost be $1 million. This digital product could be almost $1 million. And the reality is it might, but so you laugh, Everett, but it might, but it just depends on what you're treating and what the cost of those patients are today, right? Treating cancers, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I don't think there'll be a digital product that cures cancer, but assuming one comes out someday, then yeah, a couple $100,000 would be appropriate. So I think those are, and we've seen this, and Everett has seen it because we've done pricing in the past. It's really easy to say, okay, this value is through the roof, right? This is going to be paid for, but it's really about the cost offsets and understanding your unique fit and who's paying for it, and knowing that type of stuff up front and being open and honest with yourself and with venture capital is, I think, would probably drive you towards success.
Thank you. And so what's the biggest issue you'd say to look out for? Because obviously you've named clinical validation, understanding how to commercialize, making sure you got the right data, and being honest with yourself. What would be the biggest sort of like warning sign you'd put anyone trying to commercialize a digital therapeutic?
I mean, Everett and I probably agree. It's the reimbursement piece, right?
Yeah, I agree with that. I also would say kind of what drives reimbursement, which isn't necessarily the payer buy-in. That absolutely is part of it, but this extraordinary thing happens when you are creating value for patients and physicians and returning value to a payer, and that is that payers figure out a way to reimburse and pay. I think a big challenge is that people look at the state of how a product is monetized. They kind of jump over multiple steps. And so in digital therapeutics, often how a product is monetized is that in payer, whether it's a health insurance company, employer, et cetera. But what you really need to see are physicians demanding the product for their patients. And when that happens, yeah, payers will figure it out. And they do. There are multiple examples of that where, I mean, Livongo is a good example. Livongo, sure, started in a place where there was existing coding, but they ultimately branched into a form of contracts and reimbursement that was beyond existing reimbursement pathways. And they were able to do that because They had patients and physicians asking for their product and demanding their product. And so I think it gets back to those fundamentals of solving an unmet need in a way that no other product can, targeting novel targets or addressing novel targets and bringing all the evidence, et cetera. But I think that key challenge that we all hear in this space over and over again of, well, is reimbursement really in place yet? And there's still some framing of that house that needs to be built, but to accelerate that and to accelerate that infrastructure build, I think the big thing that we need to look out for is, will physicians and will patients demand this? Because if they do, things move really quickly.
Okay, thank you. Now, because I know you've got a hard stop, Everett. Are you okay, or you need to?
Yeah, I've got a few minutes. I can I can push it off a few. So
okay, no problem. So yeah, all I was going to say at that point was, so I mean, if you were both to go back to when you started, what are your key learnings? What would you do different now than you wouldn't have thought about when you started?
Andy, you want to? I've got, that list is so long of hard learnings.
Yeah.
So I can keep it really short. I think that it would be developing evidence that would drive in developing strategies that would drive physician demand while educating the rest of the market. Because at the core of, it is a generalization, because at the core of some disease states, patient demand is what drives the needle or moves the needle. Things like obesity, for example, and weight management. Largely, that's a patient-driven, user, even consumer-driven market. But in other disease states, and by and large in other disease states, it's a physician demand-driven market. And the dominoes that start to fall when physicians start to demand things are pretty incredible. And going back, I think we focused so much in a very laser-driven way on payers, and we time and time again we had payers say, well, what do the physicians think, and will they want to use this? We should have had a better answer for that before we went into those early meetings. And now we do. Now when we go in, we've done our homework. So we did learn. It was just a hard process.
No, that's what I was thinking. Was it going through this has been such a great experience and great journey. If I'd stayed in pharma, I never would have experienced this. And so, to your point, even though there were times where it was incredibly difficult, there was never a time where I thought, this isn't exactly what I want to be doing right now. So I mean, some of the things that we learned, or some of the things that maybe I would want to do different, were sort of accidental, right? Like, does one insurance company care enough about our product to do a pilot with us? Well, awesome. That's the one I'm going to, right? Yeah. I've had people say to me, how do you strategically pick like 5 to 10 different pilots with different payers? And I'm like, I talk to as many as I can, and hopefully one of them says yes.
Yeah. So I suppose what you're saying, it's all about trying to understand the whole of the process better. So how those interdependencies work together, so that you're not just going, because I think in most sales, people always think, I've got to go to the payer. If I can get the money, then I'm fine. When actually, you got the money, but no one wants to buy, or no one's actually been influenced to buy. So you need to do it all almost like at the same time, so that when you go into one, we've got the reimbursement, so that's no problem. You can prescribe, and we've got the prescribers. So when you reimburse, people are going to use it, etc. So I think that's a very good lesson for anyone who's in any kind of healthcare environment, really. Sorry,
and it's a really good point. I'm glad you say that, because you'll see different leaders in this industry who have different backgrounds, right? It was big in pharma when it first started. People were pulling people out of pharma with that experience. But I would say one of the most unique people was my last CEO at Cognito, because he came out of specialty. And while there's a lot that especially doesn't mirror digital therapeutics, that building of the ecosystem is almost exactly the same, like ensuring that you have your key opinion leaders and your market influencers, and that they're loud about it, and that the patient's voices are heard. And all of a sudden, when you build all of that, then the medical policy question of when that's going to get updated at the payer level is a lot different, because they already have people in their ear saying, we need this, we need it now. And so that approach is really important, especially with where we're at in the industry. Pharma, you can be prescribed, right? As soon as you launch a new drug, it can be prescribed. That is not the case at all for us. And the other thing is, if you have high cholesterol, you're like, okay, I'll take medication. I'll fix that over time. I'm not going to have a heart attack tomorrow, most likely. But the patient journey that you watch in specialty, right? If you're diagnosed with cancer, that's not an easy thing to hear, right? Which is why a lot of those manufacturers have so many additional services for the patients along the journey, that if in Cognito's, as an example, if you get prescribed a diagnostic to be potentially your child has autism, that's not like I'll just do this and we'll just see, it'll be fine. That's a parent saying, wow, this is going to impact the rest of all of our lives in this family. And so you need more than just, hey, it's prescribed and then you're going to get a diagnosis. And I'll leave it at that because I'm rambling and I know Everett needs to jump.
So I want to thank you both, actually, because it's been really interesting. I think we've scratched the surface. I'm probably going to contact you offline and try and get you back on so we can actually delve a bit deeper into rabbit hole, because we've really just touched the very surface of it. So from if there's somebody watching this, listening to this, who's interested in digital therapeutics, or they've already started down that line, but you don't know them, Andy, for example, how would they get in contact with, Digital Therapeutics Alliance?
Go to our website, dtxalliance.org, and you can probably reach me directly, or LinkedIn. We have people that manage that too, which if you want to follow up, I can give you their contact information if people want it, because we'd love to talk to everybody. We're a global organization, so we're in 16 different countries. So it's not like if you're in the UK, we don't offer value to you. We absolutely do. Okay,
so perfect. So I'll drop those links into the podcast. So as I said, I'm going to try and get these guys back on, because I'm finding it fascinating, and I know that obviously we've got short time today. So Andy Molnar and Everett Crossland, thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Hakeem. This has been a real pleasure.
Yes, appreciate it.
Cheers.